Authentication means who are you, while authorization means what are you allowed to do. In this video, I'm going to be explaining what authentication and authorization really means, the right approaches you should be taking when it comes to authentication and authorization, how to authorize and protect your routes and endpoints, literally making specific endpoints only available to users with specific criteria, all in Node.js Express. It does not matter whether you've built code apps in Express before or just getting started. By the end of this video tutorial, you will no longer go around blindly copying code. Instead, you're going to understand exactly why each piece exists, how it fits together, and how you can adapt it to fit your unique need. But before we begin, please make sure to subscribe to the channel Dev Support Global, and also remember to hit that notification bell so that you get notified whenever we drop more amazing content like this one. You can see authentication as the process of verifying that a user that wants to log into an account is who they claim to be. The process of limiting access to specific resources based on specific criteria is called authorization. There are two main ways of authenticating and authorizing users in Node.js, and these ways include sessions and JWT tokens. The first one, which is the traditional based approach, is server-side session. How this works is when you log into an application, you submit your username and your password, and that information gets sent to the server. The server then validates that these credentials are correct and then creates a session object for that particular user in its records. The server then sends back the session ID to the browser. The browser in turn then stores it in its cookie jar, and because it's stored in its cookie jar, it automatically gets included on every request that is sent to the backend. On the server, every request coming in now has a session ID, and with that session ID, the server is able to look up and figure out what user is trying to make the request, and then returns content tailored for that logged in user. This gives you a stateful session between the client and the server. It works well, but it has a few drawbacks. Firstly, you're going to need to have to maintain a shared session store if you plan to scale horizontally, and also you're still vulnerable to cross-site request forgery attack if you don't take precautions. JWT based authentication, on the other hand, solves the scaling issue by being stateless. After you log in successfully and have been authenticated and verified, the server then generates a JWT token, signs it with a private key that you provided, and then returns that signed token back to the browser. The browser in turn then stores the signed token in its local storage so that it can be accessed later when needed. Now, on every subsequent request to the backend, the browser needs to attach that token that we saved in the local storage. The server simply verifies the signature of this token that was provided in the authorization header, and then read the claims and information available inside the JWT without the need for a database lookup. This makes it more efficient in distributed systems. The downside here is that an attacker can still steal that token, and if it gets stolen, you cannot revoke that token until the token expires, unless you implement mechanisms like token blacklisting or short-lived token. Both approaches have their own security considerations, so make sure you choose the one that best suits your application's needs. For the purpose of this video, we'll be focusing on authenticating and authorizing users using JWT. If after everything I've explained you prefer using the sessions approach, all you just need to do is to check out my channel for a video on that. Before we dive in and start coding, just a quick note. If you would like some one-on-one help, whether it's about authenticating and authorizing users in Node.js or about any other general programming challenge that you may be experiencing, I offer programming support consultations in 60-minute time slots that have been designed to walk you through your specific use case. So feel free to book a call if you would rather have me guide you one-on-one. Otherwise, let's jump right in. Now, the first thing we need to do is to set up and initialize our Node.js Express application. So to do that, let's go ahead and create a destination where our project is gonna live. So let's go ahead and create a directory called Auth app, and then we cd into Auth app. Now that we've created a location for our app to live, the next thing we need to do is to initialize with npm. So we have to run the script npm init-y, and this goes ahead and initializes our application. So now that we've initialized our application, let's go ahead and open up this application in our IDE. Now that we've opened up the app in our IDE, the next thing we're going to do is to go ahead and install our app dependencies. App dependencies are used to define external modules that our application needs to run. I'm going to go ahead and tell you about each dependency we are going to be using and why we are using them. The first one on the list is Express. Express is a minimal unopinionated web framework for Node.js. It lets you easily define routes like get/users, post/login. It also helps you easily define middlewares for login, parsing, and authentication validation check, and also enables error handling in a clean, composable way. Almost every Node backend uses Express or a cousin of it for handling HTTP. The next dependency we're going to be using is Node.jsondb. Node.jsondb is a database completely in JSON. It's a simple database that uses uses a JSON file as its database. This is what we're going to be using as our database for this video. The next dependency on the list is JSON Path Plus. JSON Path Plus is used to analyze, transform, and selectively extract data from JSON documents. This is what we're going to be using to perform complex search queries and filtering on our Node.json database. The next dependency on the list is Morgan. Morgan is a HTTP request logger middleware for Express. It logs information about every incoming request, information like the request method, the URL, status code, and the response time to the console. This makes it easy to debug, monitor traffic patterns, and spot errors in development. The next dependency we'll be using is called bcrypt.js. Bcrypt.js is a pure JavaScript implementation for hashing passwords. You should never store passwords in plain text. Bcrypt.js provides a slow sorted hashing function that defends against rainbow table and brute force attacks. Bcrypt.js is easy to install and is recommended. The next dependency we're going to be using is JSON Web Token. JSON Web Token is a library that is used to sign, verify, and decode JSON Web Tokens, also known as JWTs. JWTs are a compact, stateless, URL-safe way to represent claims between two parties. Claims like user123 is authenticated until timestamp X. With JSON Web Token, you can sign a token with your server's secret key and then verify it on each request to protected route. The next dependency we'll be using is called .env. .env is a zero dependency module that loads environment variables from a .env file into process.env. .env enables us to keep sensitive configuration out of our source code. Sensitive configuration like API keys, database URLs, and JWTs secret. You define variables in a local .env file, and .env pulls these variables and injects them at runtime, so your code can call these variables without ever hard coding the secret. The next and the last dependency we're going to be talking about is NodeMon. NodeMon is a development tool for Node.js application that automatically restarts your server whenever it detects changes in your source code file. So now that I've explained all of that, let's go ahead and install these dependencies by running the npm install command. Now that we're done installing our dependencies, the next thing we need to do is to continue setting our app. To do that, first thing is to open up our packet.json. Now the first thing I usually like to do is to add a new field type module. I do this because it enables the project to use import statements. So now that I've said all of that, the next thing we want to do is remove the test command and put in our own commands to start our application. So what we're going to do is to delete this and write dev command, and this is gonna be nodemon index.js, or let's just say nodemon dot. So we're using dot because when you use dot, it just runs whatever is set as your main folder here. So nodemon dot just runs index.js. So we could add a start command if we're ever gonna run this in production, and that's gonna be node dot. Now that we've done all of that, the next thing we want to do is to actually create an entry point for our application. So we're going to create a new index.js file, and inside this file we're going to go ahead and import unnecessary dependencies that we installed earlier. So we have Express, we have the env/config, we have Morgan. To bootstrap our application, these are literally the dependencies that we need. So to use them, we're going to set up a new Express app, and then we're gonna add a middleware express.json. What this does is that it literally sets up a middleware that passes JSON on request with the content type application/JSON. We're also gonna set up our Morgan for login, and we're gonna set it to dev. Now that we've done all of that, the next thing we need to do is to set up our server. To set up the server, we need to import HTTP. It's a built-in package, and we come here and then create a server. Click on server, goes to http.create server, and then we'll pass in our Express application. Now that we've done that, next thing we want to do is to now listen. We need to listen on a port, so let's set up a port. Let's say port 3060. We pass that port in, and then there's a callback. In that callback, we just want to console.log auth app is running. Now that I've done all of that, the next thing we need to do is to go ahead and start our application. So to start application, we'll run the command that we set up in our packet.json earlier. We're going to run the dev command to run a development server, and as you can see, it says auth app is running. So we've set up our authentication application successfully, and that will be it for this section. For the purpose of this video, we are going to be setting up 3 API endpoints. The first API endpoint we'll be setting up is the Signup endpoint, which is the endpoint that users would be able to use to sign up and get an account on our platform. The second endpoint we're going to be working on is the login endpoint. This is the endpoint that collects the email and password from the user and authenticates and verifies that they are who they claim to be. And the third endpoint is a protected endpoint that we are going to be using to fetch the information of the currently logged in user. We're going to go ahead and start writing the first endpoint. So the first endpoint endpoint is our post endpoint. So we're going to go ahead and write a new method to app the post, and we're going to call this endpoint sign up, and it accepts our callback with argument request, response, and next. Put this in the try cat so that we can listen for errors function wide. And what we're just going to do is first console.log errors if there are any, and return back to the front end a status of 500 and a message of something went wrong. When a user wants to sign up to our application, we're going to collect information like the first name, the last name, an email address, and a password. Let's go ahead and access the information that will be sent back to us, which is available in request.body. I'm going to destructure it. Request.body. We expect an email, a password, and our full name. So all of this information is going to be collected from the user and then passed to us, the backend. Before we continue, let's go ahead and do a quick sample check so that we do not go ahead and process this if the required information we need is not yet available. Go ahead and let me copy this. Yeah, I'm going to return 400 and tell you some required fields are missing. Moving on, the next thing we want to do is to make sure that this email address doesn't already exist in our database. To do that, we first need to set up our database. To set up our database, we're going to import node.jsondb. So we're going to import JSONDB and config from node.jsondb. To set it up, we just need one line. The line I said, you can see that this sets up our database. It takes in arguments, and if I hover on this, you can see that it takes in a file name and a couple of options. If it's human readable, what the separator should be, if it should save on push, if it should sync on save. This is literally what we need to set up our database. Now that we've set up our database, let's go ahead and continue writing our sign up endpoint. Moving on, we want to check if this email address exists before we even continue processing this information. To do that, we first want to pull all our data from our database. We are pulling all our data because of the type of database we are using. This is a JSON database. I'm going to await this, and I need to make this fallback an asynchronous one. Now that we've imported our data, the next thing we want to do is to go ahead and filter it, and that's where JSON path plus comes in. I'm just going to go ahead and paste that query, and here you can see that we now have a filtered data that is returned from JSON path, and we passed in a query saying on the node user fetch objects where their email matches the email that we passed in, and the data to check against is all data, which is data that we pulled from our database. Now JSON path is going to return an array of results. To continue, we just need to make sure the filtered data doesn't have more than 0 object in the array. So if it's greater than 0, then we need to throw an error, and we change this to email address already in use. Now that we've done that and we've made sure that the email address doesn't already exist in our database, the next thing we want to do is to hash our password. Remember, like I said earlier in this video, you should never store your password in plain text. To hash our password, we're going to say const hash password, which is a variable where we're going to store the hashed password. Then we're going to import bcrypt. So import bcrypt from bcrypt.js, and we're going to say bcrypt.hash, and then we're going to pass in password, which is the password that was sent to us from the client, and then we're going to pass in a salt. So let's just pass in 10 as the salt. So now that we've hashed the password, the next thing we need to do is to structure the user object. We're just going to pass in email. We're gonna, under the key password, pass in hashed password and the full name. And to actually push this data into our database, we're going to do db.push, set up a data path / users, and then pass in an array. The point of me doing this is so that it appends this data to the node / users. It doesn't overwrite what is there. Then we pass in the data, so user. So let's also await this. The next thing we want to do is to now send a response back to the front end, telling them that our operation was successful. So we send our 201 because we just created a new record, and send a message account created successfully, please log in. Now that we've done all of that, let's go ahead and test this endpoint and then move on to the login end. To test our sign up endpoint, I'm just going to create a new file in my file system, call this rest.http. Now we want to make our post request to localhost 3060/signup. Let's not forget to set the content type to applications/json. If not, our express.json is not going to pick up the variables that we're sending in. The next thing we have to do is to set up our request payload. We need to send the email address. I'm just going to put in inquiries at dev support global gmail.com. I'm going to pass in a password, say password 123 and then pass in a full name. Let's call this DSG. Now that we're done with that, let's go ahead and hit the send button. As you can see, it gave us an error, something went wrong, and the error that was console.log here says that JSON path is not defined. I don't think we imported JSON path plus. Let's just go ahead and import that. Import JSON path from JSON path plus. Now that we've imported JSON path, let's go ahead and run our request again. When we hit send request, says socket hang up, is because we are trying to write to our database and that is making nodemon to restart. All we have to do is exclude our database from nodemon. To do that, we add the ignore flag and tell it to ignore my database.json so that whenever we add data there, it does not restart our server. Now that I've done that, the next thing we need to do is to restart our server. So restarting it, and now run our request again, and we can now see that our request was successful. It says account created successfully, please log in. If we go to our database, we can see that we have our database here. We have the email, we have the password that is hashed, and we now have the full name. Now that this user has signed up, let's go ahead and try to sign up with this email address and see what happens. Click on send request. You can see that it says email address already in use, and this is because of the check that we added earlier when we were creating our sign up endpoint. Now that we're done with this, we're going to be moving on to the second endpoint, which is a login endpoint. To continue, we're going to go ahead and create a post request, but this time for our login, and this also accepts our callback. Most of the early logic in the login endpoint is kind of similar to that in the sign up endpoint. I'm just going to copy and edit. Let's just copy up until here and paste it in, and there is no full name like this asynchronous. If filter data.length is greater than 0, we want to say if it's less than 1, then it means that count does not exist, invalid credentials provided. So now that we're done with that and we now know that the account exists, we are now going to compare the password on that user object with the password that was provided to us to make sure it's a proper match. So to do that, we're going to say const password match is bcrypt.compare. We pass in the password. Let's first extract the users, the first item in filter data. We have to first pass in the password that was provided to us, and then we pass in the hash that is saved in our database. The next thing we need to do is, if passwords do not match, then we just need to tell them that the credentials they provided were invalid. Quick one, we need to await this, change here to 4. Now that we've done series of checks and we now know that the user exists and the password that they provided matches the one that we've hashed and stored in our database, the next thing we need to do now is to generate a JWT token and then send that JWT token back to the client so that it can be used to authorize requests to protected end. Having said that, let's move on and generate our JWT token. Before we can even go ahead and start creating JWT tokens, we need to generate a JWT secret. So generate a JWT secret, I'm just going to come here to my terminal, create a new terminal, and run the command open SSL run -base 6432, and this is going to generate a new secret for us. So we're going to copy this secret, create a new local.env file. Let's call this variable JWT secret and paste it in there. Now that we've done that, we can go ahead and generate a JWT token. So let's say const token, because JWT.sign, we need to import JWT, import JWT from JSON Web Tokens. So JWT.sign, pass in a payload, so we can just pass in the user's email address, and then we need to pass in a secret, processor.env.jwt secret, and then we need to pass in an expiration time, and let's say it expires in an hour. This is what I was trying to say earlier in the video. This token that we are generating, if it ever gets stolen by an attacker, you literally cannot do anything until the time you set here expires. That is, if you don't implement token blacklisting or other mechanisms to combat this. Now that I've said that and we've done this, the next thing we need to do is to go ahead and return back to the front end of 200 and a message telling them login successful, and then pass the token. So now that we are done writing our login authentication endpoint, let's go ahead and test it. To test, we can literally copy this and then we put in hashes so it differentiates it. Let's change this to login and remove a full name. So before we try with the correct credentials, let's try with the wrong credentials and see what happens. So I'm going to remove one full stop and hit send request, and as you can see, it tells us invalid credentials provided. If I go ahead and remove a letter in the email and hit send. See, it says account does not exist, invalid credentials provided. Now if I go ahead and put in the proper credentials and hit send, it now tells us login successful, and it then returns a token to us. Now that I've said that, let's go ahead and create a protected route that requires authorization using an authorization token, or a JWT, aka JSON Web Token. Now let's go ahead and create a new endpoint, but this is going to be a get endpoint. Let's say this is /fetch account info. This accepts an asynchronous callback request response. Also put in a try catch. I'll just copy this. Now before we can complete this endpoint and call it protected, we need to set up a middleware that is going to protect it. To set up the middleware, we're going to write a function and name this function authenticate request. Now this function takes in a request and a response, and we're also gonna give it a try catch too. We also want to add the next, because since this is a middleware, when we're done processing logic, we want to call the next function so that it moves on and executes the next middleware in the chain of processing. The first thing we want to do is to extract the JWT token or authentication token that was sent to us in the authorization header. To do that, we're going to have const token plus request the headers, the authorization. In the case that this may not exist, let's fall back to an empty string, and then we're going to split by space and take element and index 1. We are doing this because we usually expect this to be in a bearer token association like this. What we're doing is that we're splitting by the space, and then we're grabbing the item on index 1. So this is index 0 and this is index 1. Now that we've grabbed our token, the next thing we need to do is to verify that this token is valid and hasn't expired. To do that, we're going to do const response equals jwt.decode, pass in the token, and then pass in our environment variable JWT secret. We actually want to do JWT.verify here, not JWT.decode, because when we use verify, it verifies the signature and then decodes the payload, but if we just use decode, it just goes ahead and decodes it without verifying its signature. Now we need to make sure that there's a response, and if there is no response, we need to throw an error. So just going to copy this and 401 for unauthorized, and tell them unauthorized access. We also want to add a check if a token does not exist, so I'm just going to copy this and change here to if there is no token, then same as unauthorized access. If there's a response, it means that the token has been verified, the signature is valid, and we've decoded it and gotten the payload that we put into it when we were creating the token. The next thing we need to do is to get that payload, which is the email, and it's gonna be available in response.email, and then we set in our request.user object, we pass in our email, and then invoke the next function. Now that we're done with this middleware function, we just need to apply this middleware on the route that we want protected. For our case, we're just going to set it in the fetch account route because that's the route that we want protected. So literally what it means is that when you hit the /fetch account endpoint, it first runs the authenticate request middleware before running our actual application logic. That was the point of the next here. So what the next does is that it tells Express that everything was successful in this middleware and you can move on to whatever you have in your chain of processing. To finish this endpoint, we just need to access the email address that authenticate request makes available in request.user. So we just do const email equals request the user the email. Then the next thing we need to do is to look up and fetch the actual information of this user in our database, which is kind of similar to the login. So we can just copy that and scroll down back and paste this in and remove this check. The only thing different we're going to now do is to return the user's information. So let's just go ahead and return that. So the status 200.json, give it a message, call it success, and send the data, which is user. What we've done just now is what is called authorization. We are literally limiting access to this user's information only when they log in. So if you try to access this information and you're not logged in, you are not authorized to do that. You are now limited and cannot access this data. So when you finally do log in and you get a JWT token, you are now authorized to access this information. Now that we've said all of that, let's go ahead and test our final endpoint. To test our final endpoint, we just need to demarcate. This time it's a get request and it's going to localhost fetch account info, the content type application JSON, and we want to add authorization, which is bearer, and the token. So to get the token, let's just log in again. So we copy this token. Let's see what happens when we try to make a request without the token. It tells us unauthorized access. Let's say we just put in something random. It tells us something went wrong, and the error down here is JWT malformed. This is because the signature of the JWT we passed in is invalid. Let's go ahead and put in the actual JWT and log in, and now you can see that it has provided us with the information that we require. We weren't authorized, and now we became authorized because we logged in successfully into our account. And that's a wrap on authenticating and authorizing users in Node.js. Before we close out, I want to share a couple books that have really changed and sharpened my mind and skills as a developer. I've read every one of these books cover to cover, and if you take just a few lessons from them, I promise that you'll write better, more maintainable code. So here are my top picks. The first book on the list is Dr. Barry's Guide to AI Prompt Engineering. If you're an AI enthusiast, this book is for you. If you are a developer in this time and age that leverages AI, then that is a book that you should read. The second book is From Zero to Hero by engineer Jack Lyers. Most of the time as developers, we are confused or we battle with imposter syndrome. If you're that type of developer, then you need to read that book. Remember, like I've said, I've read this book end to end, and I am now recommending this book because I always recommend books in my videos that you should read to make you, my viewers, better developers. So pick them, dive in, and I'm sure that you will come up with new habits that you can apply almost immediately. And I'll be dropping the link to these resources in the description below. If you found this tutorial helpful, consider contributing a few dollars via the tip link that I put in the description box below. Your support helps me to keep on creating more amazing free content like this, and it literally keeps the light on here at Dev Support Global. Again, thank you for watching. Please make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so that you get notified when we drop more amazing content like this one. And also, do not forget, like I said earlier, I offer programming support consultations in 60-minute time slots that have been designed to walk you through your specific use case. Until next time, happy coding and stay secure.